You can't afford it. The two flight attendants whispered, blocking a woman in jeans and a simple jacket at the entrance to the first-class cabin, their eyes filled with disdain. They didn't know. That woman owned the entire airline. Just 5 minutes later, their smug smiles turned to pale shock as Josephine Chandler pulled out an employee badge, the words CEO gleaming under the cabin lights. And that moment was only the beginning of a flight that would shake the company's culture, push 3 careers to the brink, and forever change how an airline viewed its passengers. Think about it, what really happened on that flight. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, flooding the 40th floor boardroom at Skyline Airways headquarters with a soft golden hue. Josephine Chandler, or Jo, as those close to her called her, stood silently at the room's edge, her gaze fixed on the distant runways of O'Hare Airport. From this height, the planes were nothing more than tiny silver specks, rolling quietly, lifting into the sky. A soft cough broke the silence behind her. Revenue's up 12% this quarter compared to last year, reported Robert Hayes, the CFO, adjusting his glasses. A pretty solid result. Jo nodded, but her eyes remained locked on a Skyline jet just lifting off. At 52, with her slender frame and salt and pepper bun, she didn't fit the typical CEO image. No luxury cars, no flashy penthouse. She drove an old sedan, lived in the same modest house for 20 years, and still preferred jeans and a tea when there wasn't an event. Her only standout feature, the unwavering sharpness in her eyes. What about the other metrics, Jo asked, her voice calm but laced with authority. The air in the room tightened. There's an issue. Sarah Williams, head of customer experience, spoke up. Passenger complaints are up 7% from last quarter, mostly tied to first-class service. Jo turned, her eyes narrowing. Specifically, she pressed. Sarah glanced around, lowered her voice. A lot of passengers feel the first-class crew is condescending, especially toward those who don't dress upscale or look wealthy. Turner! Jo frowned. Each word hit her like cold water. 30 years ago, she'd been in those shoes, a young flight attendant, rolling her carry-on, bowing to every passenger, no matter if they wore a tailored suit or a worn-out sweater. She'd never forgotten those days. And now, her airline, her life's work, was letting this happen. Sarah slid an iPad toward her. Here's the latest feedback. Jo read the screen. One comment jumped out. I felt judged for wearing jeans and a backpack. The crew looked at me like I didn't belong in first class. I paid like everyone else, but they served me like I was borrowing. Jo set the iPad down, arms crossed. I need to see it for myself. Robert raised an eyebrow. You mean undercover? Jo cut in, voice firm. I'll fly as a regular passenger. No announcements, no special treatment. I want the real experience. The room went silent. Robert furrowed his brow. But you're the CEO. Someone's bound to recognize you. Jo smiled, a strange lightness in her face. I just walked past 3 front desk agents in the lobby. None of them knew who I was. She ran a hand through her loose hair. They're used to seeing me in a suit. On the website's profile photo, a 50-something woman in a hoodie. No one looks twice. This is risky, Sarah murmured. Riskier, Jo replied, is sitting here pretending we don't see it. No one argued. Jo sat at the head of the table, scanning each face. Book me on tomorrow's Chicago-New York flight. First class, was Silvershire. Reservation under J. Chandler, wanted for an issue. Use my personal card. And no one informs the crew. And if you run into issues, Michael, her assistant asked softly. Jo's hand tightened around the armrest. Then I'll know exactly what needs fixing. As the meeting adjourned, Jo lingered alone. She turned back to the window, watching a Boeing taxi to the runway. Before you teach them to sell first class, she whispered to herself, you have to teach them to see the person. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the bedroom curtains, casting a warm glow across Josephine's face. She stood in front of the mirror, studying herself carefully. Her salt and pepper brown hair left loose, No bun, no hairspray. She pulled on a light gray hoodie, faded jeans, and worn sneakers. No makeup. No jewelry. Her luxury watch was replaced by a cheap supermarket brand. Perfect, Joe whispered, pulling a navy baseball cap low over her face. The powerful CEO had disappeared. Staring back in the mirror was simply a middle-aged woman, someone who'd blend into any airport crowd. Her phone buzzed. A text from Michael. Tickets booked. Flight 372. 2:15 p.m. Chicago to New York. Booking code. Rena de Serenidar. J. Pronin. Chandler. You're sure you don't want anyone informed? Joe texted back. No. Absolutely no priority. I want to be a regular passenger. Michael replied. Good luck, boss. Joe smiled faintly, packed a few essentials into a small backpack. A toothbrush, a paperback novel, water bottle. This wasn't a leisure trip. It was a mission. She headed out. The company car waited at the curb, but she waved it off. Oh, I'm taking a rideshare. She opened the app. An old Toyota pulled up. The young driver grinned warmly. Airport. Skyline, he asked. Actually, United Airlines, Joe replied with a sly smile. Then chuckled. Kidding? Skyline. No problem. Ma'am, the driver said, unfazed. They cruised through Chicago's streets, sunlight slicing between skyscrapers. Joe gazed out the window, a mix of anticipation and nerves bubbling inside. How long had it been since she traveled as just another passenger? No VIP lanes, no priority boarding. At the airport, Joe slung her backpack over her shoulder, merging into the bustling crowd. She bypassed the priority check-in, instead stepping into the long line with regular passengers. Ahead, a mother struggled with a crying child. Behind, a businessman barked into his phone about $1 million deal. No one recognized her. Chandler. JFK. Joe told the agent at the counter. The agent typed rapidly. No eye contact. No smile. No enjoy your flight. A boarding pass slid across the desk. Gate A17. Domos. Boarding at 1. Sherby can run a sepi in cuts. How words femi? Joe took the pass quietly. Even here, at the counter, the service had already begun erasing the passenger. She passed through security, no priority lane, stood barefoot with everyone else, removing her laptop, waiting patiently as her bag was scanned. Finally, she reached the gate. A17 was packed. The monitor blinked. Now boarding her first class and elite members. Joe stood, pulled out her boarding pass, and joined the first class line. At the boarding podium, the agent glanced briefly at her ticket, gave her a perfunctory nod, no greeting, unlike the beaming smile she'd just given the Armani-suited man ahead of Joe. Joe mentally logged the moment. At the plane door, a flight attendant, Victoria, her name tag sparkling, smiled brightly at the passenger ahead. Welcome aboard. Sir, may I take your coat champagne? When it was Joe's turn, Victoria's smile faltered. Her eyes flicked to the hoodie. Her brow creased. The smile vanished. Boarding pass. Her tone was flat. Joe handed it over. Victoria raised an eyebrow. First class. Left aisle. Her voice was cold, skeptical, as if she couldn't believe Joe belonged there. Thank you, Joe replied calmly. She stepped into first class. Leather seats gleamed. Passengers adjusted ties, chatted about investments, and launched Zoom calls. Another flight attendant, Jacqueline, poured champagne, hung jackets for each guest. When Joe reached her seat, Jacqueline paused, looked at her, then moved on. No greeting, no offer to hang her jacket. Joe lifted her own backpack, stowed it herself, and fastened her seatbelt. A few moments later, Jacqueline returned. Pre-departure drink. Her voice is icy. No smile. Sparkling water. Please, Joe requested softly. Jacqueline poured the drink, set it down without a, my pleasure, without acknowledgement, and walked away. Joe stared at the glass. A small gesture, but it said everything. She leaned back, quietly observing. The flight had only just begun, but the cracks in service were already visible. And here she sat, a woman in a hoodie, an outsider in the kingdom of first class. The plane gradually filled up, the chatter of passengers mingling with the thud of overhead bins closing and footsteps across the carpet. Josephine sat still, fingers lightly tracing the rim of her water glass, her eyes quietly observing every movement around her. Small details usually invisible to the average person stood out with crystal clarity under her gaze. Jacqueline moved about like a graceful dancer, but only for the right passengers. For the men in tailored suits, she poured champagne with a practiced flourish, hung up jackets with both hands, smiled her textbook perfect smile, her eyes sparkling with warmth. But when a young man in a hoodie boarded late, her expression shifted instantly. Cold, scrutinizing, impatient. Josephine watched as the young man awkwardly searched for his seat, flustered when Jacqueline asked him to double-check his boarding pass, even though it was perfectly valid. He finally sat across from Josephine, exhaling quietly, his eyes a mix of embarrassment and frustration. A few minutes later, Josephine stood, walking toward the restroom at the front of the cabin. As she passed the galley, she stopped in her tracks. The whispered voices of Victoria and Jacqueline carried straight into her ears. "Another one who doesn't belong here," Victoria sneered. "Did you see his sneakers? Probably clearance rack at some discount store." "And the old lady in 2A, Jacqueline chimed in, a snide laugh underlining her words. "This isn't first class anymore. It's embarrassing. Siri de warning on Tiffany ones." Josephine clenched her fists. A heat surged through her chest. These weren't random remarks. They were the root of a culture slowly rotting from within. She hurried into the restroom, closed the door, leaned against the wall, and took a deep breath. In that moment, an image flashed before her. Herself 30 years ago, in a flight attendant's uniform, heels broken after a long-haul flight, smiling through customer complaints. She'd once promised herself, when she rose to leadership, she'd protect that dignity, uphold that spirit. But now, the very airline she'd dedicated her life to had forgotten its soul. Stepping out, Josephine returned to her seat, her eyes meeting the young man's across the aisle. He gave a small, uneasy smile. "Didn't think they'd act like that just because of a hoodie," he murmured. Josephine nodded softly. "I know that feeling." Her voice was low, but her gaze was steady. The seatbelt sign chimed off as the plane climbed into the clouds. Jacqueline began handing out hot towels for the suited passengers. Towels perfectly folded, delivered with silver tongs. A gentle "please enjoy" for Josephine and the young man. The towels were dropped flat onto their trays, no eye contact, no words. Josephine placed a hand over the towel, smoothing its wrinkles. "It's just a towel," she thought. "But how it's given says everything." Later, as Jacqueline pushed the beverage cart, Josephine lifted her hand politely. "May I have another water, please?" Jacqueline glanced briefly. "In a bit," she replied curtly. The cart rolled past. 10 minutes, 15 minutes. She never returned. Other passengers had their glasses refilled endlessly. Josephine's remained empty. She pressed the call button. Jacqueline appeared, faint irritation on her face. "Something wrong?" she asked. "I've been waiting for water," Josephine reminded. "Oh, sorry. Forgot." The apology fell flat. The eyes behind it, unapologetic. The glass was set down hastily. No acknowledgement. No warmth. Josephine took a sip not to quench her thirst, but to swallow the ache of watching her beloved airline transform into a theater of invisible discrimination. Meal service began. When the tray landed in front of Josephine, she noticed it immediately. Her dish was lukewarm, sloppily arranged, cutlery misaligned, and napkin crumpled. She glanced sideways at the suited man next to her, his plate steaming hot, utensils perfectly straight, napkin folded into a swan. Same ticket. Terpininawasanum. Same price. But not the same service, Josephine thought, her gaze sharpening. The young man across the aisle offered a faint, resigned smile. Didn't think first class would make me feel lesser, he said quietly. Josephine met his eyes, shook her head gently. It's not you, she replied. It's a system that forgot why it exists. A muffled whisper carried from the galley. Josephine couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. She'd heard enough. She'd seen enough. She knew enough. Her gaze drifted to the round window, watching clouds drift past. A storm was brewing not outside, but inside her heart. It's time, she thought silently, to pull the lever. Halfway through the flight, the sky outside glowed a perfect blue, but inside the first-class cabin, the air felt increasingly stifling. Josephine sat quietly, her eyes sweeping across every detail. Victoria laughing as she poured wine for suited passengers. Jacqueline adjusting seats, offering warm towels to a man with a Rolex. Margaret, the lead flight attendant, occasionally passing by with a perfunctory nod. Never once meeting Josephine's gaze. Every service extended to Josephine. The woman in a hoodie and jeans was technically within standard, yet glaringly void of care. She glanced at her half-empty glass of water, at the cold, congealed meal tray, at the frayed sneakers of the young man across the aisle, head bowed over his phone, avoiding everyone's eyes. She knew she had once been that boy. 30 years ago, a young flight attendant was looked down upon for her humble beginnings. And now, at the pinnacle of power, she was being seen with the same lens, simply because she wasn't wearing the right armor. A faint clatter snapped Josephine from her thoughts. Jacqueline brushed past, nearly spilling water onto her hand. Sorry, Jacqueline muttered, her tone dry, eyes indifferent. Josephine inhaled deeply. It was time. She pressed the call button. A soft ding lit the overhead light. Victoria approached, her smile strained. Anything I can help with? Ma'am. Josephine looked up, her voice calm, yet razor sharp. I'd like to speak to the lead flight attendant. Victoria froze. Is there a problem? You heard me? The lead. Victoria exchanged a glance with Jacqueline, then nodded. One moment. A minute later, Margaret arrived, flashing her rehearsed smile. I'm Margaret, the lead flight attendant. How can I assist you? Ma'am. Josephine straightened, her gaze piercing. Around them, a few passengers started paying attention. There is, Josephine replied, her tone steady, each word dropping like a stone. I want to know why I and that young man have received noticeably different service from the gentleman in suits, despite holding the same first-class ticket. The cabin fell silent. Margaret blinked, a flicker of unease crossing her face. Victoria and Jacqueline stood behind her, visibly paling. I'm not sure I understand. Ma'am, Margaret managed, keeping her professional facade. You don't, Josephine arched an eyebrow, a thin smile curling her lips. She reached into her small wallet, drew out a sleek ID card, and held it up. The embossed letters gleamed under the cabin lights. Josephine Chandler, Chief Executive Officer, Skyline Airways. The air seemed to freeze. Victoria's mouth fell open. Jacqueline stepped back. Margaret, drained of color, her arms slack at her sides. Throughout this flight, Josephine spoke, voice cool yet unyielding. Pranay, I've sat here and watched. No one knew who I was. And I've seen ye, with my own eyes, Miwantin, with my own ears. The cabin murmured. A man in a suit lowered his financial paper, staring wide-eyed. The young man across from Josephine's jaw dropped in shock. You're, Margaret stammered. Yes, Josephine nodded. CEO of this airline. And I've just experienced firsthand what an ordinary passenger who doesn't wear a suit, who doesn't flash a luxury watch goes through in our own first-class cabin. Victoria scrambled to speak. We, we didn't know. That's exactly the problem. Josephine cut in, her gaze like a blade. Because you didn't know who I was. This is how you treated me. If you had known, you'd have acted differently. But let me ask, does the person in this seat, whether CEO or anyone else, deserve different service? Was my ticket cheaper? Is my seat smaller? Is my dignity worth less? Victoria dropped her eyes. Jacqueline flushed red. Margaret's breath quickened, searching for a defense she couldn't muster. Josephine rose. The cabin held its breath. After we land, she said slowly, I expect the three of you in the crew briefing room. We're going to have a conversation about what really makes an airline. Her gaze swept the cabin, meeting every passenger's eyes. And I hope each of you, everyone here, remembers today, that service should never be determined by clothing, age, or status, but by the dignity of being human. A few hands clapped softly. Then more, until a round of applause rippled through the cabin. The man in the suit nodded solemnly. The young man across the aisle gave a broad thumbs up, his smile breaking wide. Josephine sat back down, taking a deep, steadying breath. Outside, the sun lowered, painting the clouds a fiery orange. She whispered softly, This flight has only just begun. The plane touched down at JFK, taxiing along the runway bathed in the pale golden light of late afternoon. Outside, a thin veil of clouds covered the sky. Inside the first-class cabin, the air remained hushed after the moment Josephine had revealed herself. As the last passenger disembarked, Josephine remained seated, gazing out the window, her eyes distant but her posture upright. Ahead, Victoria, Jacqueline, and Margaret stood silently, their expressions uneasy. To the crew lounge, Josephine said softly, her voice calm but commanding, I'll be waiting. The three nodded slowly, walking away with stiffened backs. Josephine picked up her bag and followed, each step measured, each heartbeat heavy, not with anger, not with revenge, but with a profound, aching disappointment. The lounge door closed behind them, enclosing them in a narrow, quiet space. Victoria clenched her hands tightly. Jacqueline stared at the floor. Margaret stood tall, but her hands fidgeted, trembling faintly. Josephine sat across from them, elbows resting on the table. Her gaze swept over their faces. Before I speak, Josephine began, her voice low and steady. I want to hear from you. Silence. Margaret swallowed hard. Ma'am, she started. No excuses. Josephine cut in. I want the truth. What's Santawing year? Victoria drew a shaky breath. We've gotten used to judging passengers by appearances. It's almost instinctual. Josephine raised an eyebrow. Instinct. Who taught you that instinct? Jacqueline murmured softly. No one explicitly, but seeing how others behaved, older colleagues, former leads, we thought that's just how this industry works. And because everyone did it, you assumed it was right. Margaret lowered her head. No. But it's so easy to fall in line. Until today. Josephine nodded slowly. At least you're brave enough to admit it. She leaned back, gazing at the ceiling. 30 years ago, I was once a flight attendant like you. I don't know how to... was exhausted. I, too, was looked down upon by first-class passengers, but never did I let that bitterness turn into contempt. Victoria's eyes closed tightly, lips pressed together. Today, Ray, Josephine continued, her voice steady yet sharp. You didn't just serve a woman in a hoodie. You served someone who once stood exactly where you stand now. Someone who once believed this place was something to be proud of. A heavy silence filled the room. But today, Josephine paused, her eyes blazing. You made me ashamed. Victoria burst into quiet sobs. Jacqueline wiped her tears. Margaret remained still, her eyes glistening red. I'm not here to fire anyone, Josephine said, her tone softening. Firing doesn't change culture. Firing doesn't fix a rot that runs deep. 3 sets of eyes lifted toward her. You'll be suspended for 1 week, Josephine continued deliberately. During that time, you will attend the new training program I just approved beyond first impressions. Idris Aswajsim. It's a course on customer service, unconscious bias, and compassion. Margaret inhaled deeply, nodding faintly. When you return, Josephine added, each of you will be paired with a mentor, a veteran flight attendant, skilled not just in service, but in serving with heart. I want you to relearn not how to carry trays or pour champagne, but how to see people. Victoria sniffled quietly. Jacqueline reached over, squeezing her hand. Margaret wiped her eyes at the corners. Josephine rose from her chair. I don't need apologies, she said. I need you to change. Not for me, for the passengers and for your own dignity. She stepped toward the door, pausing to look back, her gaze gentle, yet resolute. Next time, if someone in a hoodie boards first class, I want to see a genuine smile. Then she opened the door and walked out, leaving behind 3 quiet figures, 3 minds newly awakened. Outside, night was falling, the airport lights twinkling like stars. Josephine looked up at the sky, feeling a rare, peaceful lightness. The real work, she thought, starts now. 2 weeks after that fateful flight, Josephine walked into the large conference room at Skyline Airways headquarters, holding a report in her hand. The morning light streamed through the glass walls, casting a glow on her face, equal parts firm and calm. Ladies and gentlemen, Josephine began, her gaze sweeping across the packed executive board. Today, I'd like to share the results of Beyond First Impressions, the training program we launched. Sarah, the head of customer experience, leaned forward eagerly. Robert, the CFO, furrowed his brow with concern. Some faces remained skeptical. Josephine clicked the remote. A chart appeared on the screen. In just 10 days, she spoke deliberately. Customer satisfaction has risen 14%. In first class specifically, 27%. A murmur rippled through the room. Robert raised an eyebrow. That fast, he asked. Because change starts with the smallest things, Josephine replied. A glance. A smile. A genuine welcome. She clicked again. Videos flashed across the screen. Victoria helping an elderly passenger stow luggage. Jacqueline kneeling to chat with a young boy traveling with his parents. Margaret teaching a group of junior flight attendants about unbiased service. Sarah smiled, nodding. Beautiful, Sarah said. Not just beautiful, Josephine emphasized. This is how Skyline survives. An airline doesn't run on engines alone, but on the trust passengers place in us. Robert crossed his arms. But the training costs, paid for in loyalty. Josephine cut in. We've reduced complaints by 12%, saving nearly $300. No dollars in compensation in just 2 weeks. And that number will grow. The room fell silent. Josephine stepped closer to the table. I'm not asking you to agree immediately, she continued, but I'm asking you to try looking through the eyes of an ordinary passenger. Someone not wearing a suit, not flashing a luxury watch. Someone who bought that ticket with sweat, with dreams. Her eyes paused on each face. They deserved dignity. No less than anyone else. Sarah slowly began to clap. Then one more. Then 2. Until the entire room filled with applause. Not thunderous, but sincere. That afternoon, Josephine sat alone in her office. Through the window, she watched Skyline jets lined up along the runway, the sunlight gilding their metal frames. A new email pinged. From Margaret, Idib, Isinananonement. Mr. Chandler, Surasuripertum. I want to thank you, Sunaruanon in Remaidenim. That program didn't just teach me how to serve passengers. It reminded me why I chose this job. Today, when I handed a hot towel to a passenger in a hoodie, I smiled and he said, thanks. Today I actually feel welcome. IT, I think I'm starting to understand what you meant. Josephine smiled softly. She closed her eyes, leaned back, and exhaled gently. Sometimes, a small change is the seed for an entire forest. At a cafe near the airport, Victoria and Jacqueline sat together, watching a training video on Victoria's phone. On screen, certain myself wanted themselves, practicing how to greet, how to ask open-ended questions, how to see beyond clothing lenses. Victoria lightly tapped the screen. I never realized how numb I'd become. Jacqueline nodded. But at least we get the chance to start over. Victoria took a sip of coffee, gazing out the window. Yeah, afretum. Next time, no one should ever feel they don't belong here. They exchanged quiet smiles. At another airport, a young flight attendant carefully folded a towel, placing it neatly on a tray. Beside her, Margaret observed, nodding gently. Remember, Margaret said, every towel is a welcome, not just something to wipe hands. The young woman grinned. Got it. Margaret looked out at the runway, warmth filling her chest. A new generation was beginning. Josephine stood at her office window, watching the runway lights flicker on. Her hand rested over her heart, feeling its steady rhythm. She thought of the passengers boarding tomorrow, some in hoodies, some in suits, some weary, some excited, but all worthy of respect. We're only just beginning, Josephine whispered. And out there, the lights blazed brilliantly. 3 months after that historic meeting, Josephine stepped onto the stage at the International Aviation Conference, greeted by thunderous applause from hundreds of airline leaders around the world. Behind her, a large screen lit up with the words, "The Chandler Standard, a new era of passenger service." The spotlight shone on her face still simple, her hair softly curled, in a neutral-colored suit. But those eyes sparkled with conviction. 30 years ago, Josephine began, her warm, steady voice carrying through the microphone. Aki, I was a flight attendant. My job wasn't just to serve meals, demonstrate safety, or stow luggage. My job was to see people. A wave of silence rippled through the auditorium. Someone placed a hand over their heart. A European airline CEO nodded. But somewhere along the way, Josephine continued, we forgot that. We turned service into a checklist, a procedure. We labeled passengers by their suits, their shoes, and their watches. We forgot that every passenger carries a story, a worry, a hope. Images of Skyline appeared on the screen. Victoria offering a hot towel with a genuine smile. Margaret mentoring a group of young flight attendants. Jacqueline chatting with a hoodie-wearing passenger in first class. We lost our way, Josephine said slowly, until the day I put on a hoodie, boarded the very first-class cabin of my own airline, and realized we had to start over. Applause erupted. Josephine raised a hand, smiling. Beyond first impressions, our unbiased service training began at Skyline. But today, I don't want it to stop at Skyline. She looked around. I invite you, leaders of the aviation industry, to join me in this pledge. A pledge to see the person behind the ticket, behind the clothes, behind the surface. In the front row, Sarah's eyes shimmered. Robert crossed his arms but smiled, proud. A major UK airline executive raised a hand. Messine, Chandler, we want to bring your program to our teams. How do we start? Josephine nodded. We've prepared materials, trainers, and an online platform. No licensing fees. Just one condition. You must pledge sincerely. Not for PR, not because of media pressure, but because you believe passengers deserve it. The auditorium burst into applause. A CEO from an Asian airline stood, then another, then a row of hands raised in commitment. Josephine took a deep breath. In that moment, she no longer felt like the CEO of Skyline. She felt part of something bigger. That evening, Josephine sat alone at a small cafe near her hotel. A young waiter approached. Moss Wes's Chandler, he asked hesitantly. Josephine looked up, surprised. Yes, that's me. I read the article about you, about your undercover flight. You, you're the reason I want to be a flight attendant. Josephine smiled. Thank you. What's your name? Jalen. Ma'am. He blushed. I, I just wanted to say, I'm going to follow the Chandler Standard. Josephine laughed softly. The Chandler Standard, that sounds so big. No, really. Jalen nodded earnestly. No bias, ones. No judgment. Just seeing and listening. Josephine gazed at him, the clear, earnest eyes. She knew the seed had sprouted. At Chicago Airport, Margaret stood beside a group of young flight attendants. Remember, she instructed, every time you serve, it's not just delivering an item. It's a chance to create a memory for someone. Victoria approached, resting a hand on Margaret's shoulder. And never forget, everyone deserves it. Jacqueline smiled, joining them. Remember that day. Never forget, Victoria replied, eyes lifting to the sky where a Skyline plane ascended. In the Skyline office, Sarah placed a report on Josephine's desk. You won't believe this, Sarah said happily. Last month, Skyline achieved the highest customer satisfaction in our history. But more importantly, it's the messages from passengers. Josephine flipped through the pages. Thank you for making me feel welcome, even in a t-shirt. Thank you for the flight attendant who patiently spoke to my autistic son. Thank you for helping my elderly father cross the cabin without anyone complaining. Josephine slowly closed the report, gazing out the window. We're not just flying high, she whispered. We're flying with heart. The evening light bathed her face, glowing with an unwavering hope. Josephine stood by the window of Skyline headquarters, gazing out into the night sky where planes glowed under the runway lights, lining up one by one for takeoff. In that moment, she felt it. Every passenger, every crew member, every story was soaring together toward the same dream. She whispered softly, sometimes, to change an entire system, all it takes is the courage to board the flight. Wearing a hoodie, she turned, walking away, each step echoing with resolve. Never judge someone by the clothes they wear. Never underestimate the story behind their ticket. Because first class isn't defined by the seat, but by how we treat one another. And if you're fighting an unfair system, an outdated culture, a world full of bias, remember it only takes one person to begin, one person to say, enough, awu, one person to stand up. Don't wait for someone to give you permission. Step up. Don't wait for someone to change the rules. Rewrite them. Don't ask, who will do it? Say, I will. It's me. Are you being underestimated? Overlooked? Pushed aside? Turn that into the fuel to rise. You are that person. Where are you? Share your story in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel to join us in telling stories that change the world. And never forget, everyone deserves to be treated like first class. See you on the next flight.